welcome everybody to our next HDF clinic. It's our, I forgot, I stopped counting, 64th or 65th clinic. Lots of things to talk about. Actually, I just remembered, yeah, we had actually a clinic last week. We missed the week before. I checked our Google spreadsheet. There weren't any questions, but I'm going to pause anyway and ask, does anybody have a question right at this point?
No questions, Gerd.
Okay, thanks, welcome. Okay, let's go through last week's highlights, announcements. For those who are interested in the Hermes buffering system, we just had a release, the 0.70 beta release. That there's going to be, we have these monthly releases on the Hermes project, and there will be a more featureful release coming next month. But this month it was only bug fixes, and just you're not going to notice a difference functionality wise, but the current Hermes build or the previous Hermes build had a binary dependence or dependence on the Google optimization tools or Google OR tools. And since building the Google OR tools is pretty laborious, and then there were also some incompatibilities with the logging toolkit, we decided to replace this with there is a GNU linear programming, I forgot what K stands for, kit maybe. So we just replaced Google R tools with GLPK, and that seems to be fine. And but as a user of Hermes, users of Hermes shouldn't notice any change because we were also using a very limited subset of the OR tools capabilities. Then just a reminder, VFD Swimmer Beta 2 is out. If you're interested in Swimmer and in the new implementation of Swimmer, please go ahead and check it out. We are really looking for feedback there. And then most importantly, the HUG 2022 Europe presentations are now available online. Both if you go to the agenda, I think there are links to the presentation video, but then there's also a playlist on YouTube if you want to sort of take it in on a Saturday afternoon or something like that, binge watch HUG 2022 Europe, then that's a good opportunity. And yeah, thanks to Laurie, because yeah, this is a pretty intensive task to sort of do all the editing and cutting, and but it's there now. Okay, I'm going to pause before we jump into the forum. Any questions so far? No? Okay, forum. There were actually a few recent posts and a very interesting example. So I think the first two were just from today or yesterday. Someone was reporting having issues with multi-threaded writing to two files, and the user just said, reading image data from a single file, writing to two HDF5 using threads, getting runtime error doing this. What could be the reason? Again, it's not the kind of issue form that we prefer, because yeah, nothing about the platform, nothing about specific error messages and so forth. And then yeah, but okay, so in the discussion we were able to get a little more detail, and then yeah, Elena is absolutely right. She responded at some point. It turns out the user is using what we call the high-level library. So if you are using C, then there's a header file called HDF5_HL.h, and this high-level interface includes things such as the packet tables, the images, the dimension scales, and a few others along those lines. And specifically, I think the user at some point then told us, yeah, he's using in the H5 image high-level library or module. There is a function that lets you create a data set that represents a 24-bit color space raster image with sort of the decorations that are required by the specification. But long story short, the crux of the matter is really that, yeah, these high-level elements are implemented on top of the so-called core library that all the functions that you get when you include HDF5.h. And regardless, even if that core HDF5 library is compiled with thread safety enabled and so forth, unfortunately, these high-level functions, they are not thread safe. They, in other words, they are not stateless, or they are not protected in any shape or form through the typical thread safety mechanisms. And so, yeah, I can easily, or you can easily see why, if somebody uses them in a multi-threaded application, why that would lead to the types of errors that the user describes. And the only workaround would be at the moment to say, okay, you can definitely use the, if you are just interested in the data sets, again, when we say here, for example, an image, if you look at the specification, I added a link here to the specification. The specification basically says, well, if you want to store a raster image in HDF5 of a certain color depth and so forth, you're basically creating a data set, and then that data set is decorated with certain attributes. For example, there is a class attribute and a version attribute and so forth. And in case of images, you could also have an object reference or an array of object references to palettes, image palettes. And the specification describes exactly how this is represented. So you could help yourself by not using the high-level API, but rather go straight to these data sets and then inspect the attributes and so forth using a thread-safe build of the core library, and that would avoid all these issues. Is it more code? Yes, absolutely. So it's definitely more tedious, and that's why I call it a workaround and not a solution. It is really just a workaround, and yeah, but unfortunately, yeah, we have at the moment, could these high-level library extension be made thread safe? Absolutely. It's just we have neither the bandwidth nor the budget to make that happen. And okay, Elena, you have your hand up.
Another workaround maybe, and I'm not a thread programmer, but really protect the call, right? Because the call is wrapped around several HDF5 calls, so protecting this piece of code so it still can be used, especially if application uses already some kind of mechanism to protect different parts of the code.
Yeah, yeah, that's another solution. But yeah, it's going to be work one way or another, and unfortunately, yeah. If I think the in a way, the use cases, if you want to call it that are implemented in the high-level APIs, they are really useful because they are popular. Obviously, people are using them. It's just, yeah, they have not gotten the tender, loving care that they should get, and also in terms of the implementation, there are probably many things that could be improved nowadays. But yeah, it's all a question of engineering and also financial resources, and yeah, too bad, but that's where we are. Go ahead.
Just to comment with this new project, right, with multi-threading, this is one, maybe one of the candidates to, because it really uses very very small functionality and features of HDF5 library, so it probably will be very useful to create thread safe based on thread safe multi-threaded light HDF5 library. So we'll see about that.
Yeah. In this case, I don't know if there would be any performance advantages. For example, when you know you're writing an image, that means you are also writing 2, 3, maybe 4 additional attributes and so forth. Maybe for concurrency, it's not going to buy you any performance because the bulk of the data is in the data set. But it might be for asynchrony, like asynchronous access.
Right.
Yeah.
it is a pure convenience of programming and avoiding this type of errors.
Yeah. Okay. Then there was another issue, a question again. Thanks, Elena, who replied. A user was basically asking. I mean, the way I interpreted it was they are creating an object reference, and that object reference is being stored as a value of an HDF5 attribute. That's how I read that. And then I think the person who asked, well, and after the assignment, so to speak, of the attribute value, should I still call H5R destroy on that value that I was assigned? And yes, the answer is absolutely yes, because there are resources associated with that that need to be released. Otherwise, yeah, there's potential leaky behavior that may result from that. Okay, but that was a good one. And next was Lucas's example, and that was really fascinating. And yeah, definitely, I recommend you watch his presentation at HUG. So if you look in the playlist here or on the agenda, he gave a presentation, an update on HDF5 UDF, and that was great. And he mentioned something just in passing that some people might find interesting, but maybe since he just mentioned it, a lot of users maybe just didn't pick up on it. But then now he provided actually an interesting example of that. So the idea is just a recap what the capability that he developed that he called HDF5 UDF for user-defined function, is basically the ability that you can create a data set that will look and feel like an HDF5 data set, a read-only, I should say. It's a read-only data set. It's you create that data set and then you only read from that data set. You never write from it because that wouldn't mean anything. But the clue is that when you read from the data set, it will basically execute a function and a function that either calculates, so to speak, the value of that data set on the fly, and it can do that calculation in a way, for example, that it can depend on other data sets. So you can almost think as embedding a mini workflow into the computation of that data set. And that has many interesting applications. Again, in his presentation, he presented several use cases for that. One use case is, for example, you can think of something that you might also be able to do with data set transformations, although that's a rather limited mechanism. But let's say you want to do a unit conversion of another data set, or you want to do a coordinate system transformation or something like that, where you don't really want to store two copies of the same thing, and one is really just a deterministic, the result of a deterministic computation, derivation of the other, so to speak. But then this also has very interesting applications, for example, let's say for testing or other purposes. And this is the example that he provided here, is using in machine learning. This is a technique that was developed, I believe, in around 2014, of so-called GANs, or generative adversarial networks. The idea here is basically, I think many of you have seen these, I think they're called deep fakes. So where you take a certain type of images, and then, for example, faces, but also certain types of objects. And then you can train a neural network to create new instances, synthetic data, basically, where it will be difficult, or sort of, you would call these synthetic data realistic, if a different neural network that is sort of trained on discriminating whether a new image belongs to the existing collection has difficulty, or will in in the best case, the discriminator network will say, oh yeah, that's an image from this collection, or that fits in with the existing connection. So, and with this idea, you can create an HDF5 UDF-based data set that every time you read from that data set, basically invokes this generator data set. And then this generator data set, every time you invoke it, will create a new synthetic thing that from a statistical and otherwise perspective, represents an instance of a pre-trained collection. And that's what he's doing. I think the example that he uses, and he showed a screenshot, an HDF view screenshot in there. I think the original collection on which he trained the discriminator network was basically a collection of, I think, clothing or fashion items, so shoes and coats and sweaters and scarves and whatnot. And then he trained a generative network that would create additional images that will have the appearance of being drawn from that same collection. And so he then embedded basically this pre-trained network. And here he uses the ability that if you are using TensorFlow in the Keras API, you can actually store a trained neural network with all the layers and weights and so forth in HDF5 files. So what he does in this HDF5 UDF is basically read the HDF5 file that represents the weights and the layers from that generator network, that generator part of that GAN. Again, there's a generator and a discriminator. That generator, so he just reads that in as part of the invocation of that user-defined function, and then basically spits out a new image. And yeah, he's showing an example in his forum post. And yeah, it's sort of, there's a store in the US, their slogan is never the same store twice. So I changed that. This is an example of never the same HDF5 data set value twice. Of course, the shape of the data set is not changing. It's going to have the dimensions with which you defined it. But every time you read from it, you get a different set of data set elements. And so it's never the same data set twice. And that has, in my opinion, yeah, for testing purposes and otherwise, I think it has interesting applications. And the good news is, yeah, you can all put it into one HDF5 file. In his case, yeah, he took actually the generator.h5 file, the one that he dumped from TensorFlow, and he just added his UDF data set to it, and then it's all in one place. And yeah, you can impress your friends and colleagues. And very nice example. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to pause here. Otherwise, we'll move on to tips and tricks. Any questions? No? Okay. So this is something, this is more of a problem description, not so much, it's less of a tips and tricks and insights, it's more of a beware of the following. This is something that came up when we visited ITER, and we had sort of a little bit of a hands-on session on day 3. And one of the, we were trying to do something completely different, but then ran into an issue. And yeah, since we had only a finite amount of time, unfortunately, we couldn't resolve it. But yeah, I was surprised how bad things in a way were. So it has to do with HDF5 command line tools such as H5ls, H5dump, H5repack, and so forth. And on the other hand, path names that can be constructed from the link names in that file. And with special characters, I mean characters that could be either misinterpreted by the shell, because you execute these commands typically in a shell, in a bash shell or C shell or whatever, PowerShell, and special in that sense. And so here's an example. So the data set, one of the data sets with which we tried to work had that structure. So there was a top level group that was linked as equilibrium. And then under equilibrium, there was a data set that had this name, this linked name. And it's a perfectly, from an HDF perspective, perfectly legitimate linked name. Okay, there are brackets in there, and then these ampersand characters, underscores, great. Nothing here. Again, only slash and dot, as we remember, are sort of characters where you've got to be careful if you think about linked names. So there's nothing wrong here. But it turns out we have a problem, and the problem is that, number one, the tools seem to behave inconsistently, in the sense you can get things to work for some tools, but not for other tools. And it's so we need to get to the bottom of this. So I'm going to show you what I mean by that. So here's a first try. Using H5LS, I just tried to run H5LS, and the if you do H5LS-H, you have to, if you want to look at a specific, you want to inspect a specific object, then the help tells you its file name, and then basically concatenated with that the path name to that data set. Okay, and this behavior that we are seeing here, which is that the shell gets confused, is not surprising. So I would say that's fine, because when the bash shell, in this case it's a bash shell, looks at the string, yeah, it sees these ampersands, and both the brackets and the ampersand, they have special meaning in a bash shell. And so the bash shell gets sufficiently confused here, and yeah, acts like this. So ampersand, it's putting the process in the background, and then there is an array or list access with brackets and so forth. So that's not going to go well with the bash shell, and yeah, this thing just falls apart. Now, yes, so I couldn't really, when I looked around, I couldn't really find explicit documentation. But in a case like this, you say, okay, I'm just going to escape this path name part by putting it into double quotes. And that actually works. So if I put this into double quotes and then do an H5LS, and actually I put the whole thing, I should have tried this, I can't try it, I'm not going to try it right now, but if you put, I tried this, and obviously this has the correct answer. So it gets back and shows me that this is a data set, and then shows me the dimensions of this data set. So that's the right answer. That's good. But what I did not try, and I can try that if I, instead of double quoting the whole file name plus the path name to the object, if I move the double quote here, sort of the file name, and then double quote just the path name, I don't know if that works. Actually, you can't see it, but I can try it. I have a shell open here, and I can quickly try that if I can find my way back to this. Yes, I can. So let me just quickly run this here. I have to do a little bit of typing. I'm going to quote just the, and that actually works. So I just, yeah, it's not going to help, but I just did what I just said, which is move that double quote over here just before the path name to the data set, and that works, at least in my bash shell here. So it works either way. Good news. Now let's see if I move to a different tool, what happens. And so my next attempt was to use H5 dump. First attempt, and I tried to not go in sort of all the way with all the brackets and everything. I thought, well, let's do this one step at a time. So if you do H5 dump, the syntax is a little different. So in this case, I'm just saying, well, just show me the properties and the header information for that data set. I'm not interested in the data set value. And then to specify a specific path name, or in this case, a data set name, is you provide that name. And of course, now I'm aware of that, yeah, the ampersand has a special meaning in the shell. So I double quote the whole thing. And then in H5 dump, I provide the file name. And that seems to work just fine. So if I go back here, that shows me that file, and it shows me what I would expect from the H5 dump output. It turns out it's a compressed data set, and yeah, all good. Good. Second attempt. So second attempt would be to say, okay, now let's use something more complicated here, where we have a sort of additional characters that are potentially meaningful to the bash shell or to any other shell, such as these brackets, for example. And that's where it falls down or falls on its face. So here's my second attempt again, H5 dump, PhD, and then I use the earlier example where my path name is a little more complicated. And here I have the brackets and ampersand, and again, brackets and ampersand and so forth, file name. And here, the output that I'm getting from H5 dump, I mean, it appears that it does sort of the first thing, which is, yeah, basically echoing the file name of the HDF5 file. Yeah, I'll let you speak in a moment, Elena. I get an error here, and it talks about the link information from here. But what you realize is that this is, of course, only part of the way, so to speak. So it comes down here, but then it completely misses out on this piece. And okay, now I could trying to come up with trying to use backspaces for these brackets. And so now I could start a cat and mouse game and see if I can somehow wing it. But it's a problem. So it's to me, it just shows it's inconsistent between tools. And we really have to investigate what is going on here, because presumably these tools use the same tools library to parse these expressions and whatnot. So I'm a little confused.
Yeah,
Elena, please.
You're absolutely right. I believe code was refactored some time ago, but of course, apparently something went wrong to have the same parsing of input string. Said this, have you tried to enable error stack to see more errors from the last command?
I have not. I literally tried this before this meeting, and yeah, no, I'll dig a little deeper. But I just thought, yeah, I point this out because I ran into this problem, and then I thought, well, maybe when we were over there, I was just jet lagged and didn't think of something, and so I thought, let me sit down and try this, and yeah, it's really, and I think the thing is really it works for some tools. I haven't even tried to use H5 repack, for example, or some of the other tools, but it's just, yeah, between these two tools, it's already very different. And
yes, so correct me if I'm wrong, but we only don't allow backslash, right? Not backslash, forward slash, because this is separation for the group.
Yeah.
All the rest of the symbols are allowable in the
yeah. Yeah, everything else is fine in link names, and yeah, and I understand, I mean, that the shell has some other ideas here, but then this should be for the shell, unless in this case, I would have to look at, I mean, it can't be, on the one hand, I think it shouldn't be a problem because it works for H5LS. In the case of H5LS, the shell has no problem with it and just passes it on to H5LS. So why would it be all of a sudden a big deal here? And then yeah, so needs to be investigated. And unfortunately, we are at the end, and so not very uplifting, just more problems.
This is a good one. This is really good one.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Well, enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks for coming, and I'll see you next week.
Bye.
Bye.